Hi everyone, Michael here. I'm taking the time to make a little bit longer video just so I can talk through the process a little bit longer. And here with the sketch I lay in, we're going to paint a bugle today. And I lay in the ground planes and then I start just marking off various areas of the still life itself. I mean, this is just one object, but it could be many. And I'd put in reference marks for many pieces if that was the case. And I slowly build it up, referencing one area off of another. That way we can get the proportions relatively the same, and I don't have to worry about correcting my drawing so much later. That being said, the sketch I put on isn't really a finished drawing by any means. It's more or less just outlining where things are going to go on the canvas. And it can be adjusted later with paint. It's just creating the puzzle pieces to lay in the values is how I think about it. And you can see me instances laying in the reflected light areas, just as cut out puzzle pieces. You'll see me go in there and mark off more of the shadow side of the brass, leaving that central area as a little bit of light, and that was it. And here I tested a little mark from my background. I start laying it in, and it's more of a dark blue than what you see in the reference. That's a little bit warmer. Technically it's a black background, but with the warmer light it kind of greens it up. And what I do is, as I move up, I gradate the background because that's the way where the light is. But notice that upward top right value is used on the bottom left, so it looks like a diagonal gradation, and that goes from cooler and darker on the right, and diagonally moves to lighter and warmer on the top left. And right now it kind of looks like a gray violet because I added yellow to it. But as we get later into the painting, you'll see that it actually looks like a dark, warm background. And then I lay in the deep dark of the ground plane there. That's the edge of the table. And then I get into the orange card. It shows up a little more yellow in the reference photo, but that's just the photography. It's more of a really bright orange, and thus the great reflections into the bugle. Laying into the shadows of the bugle is usually where I start with any still life shadows. That helps define the shapes I find, and it gives me a good base to start from. So it's dark, but it's not black. So it's kind of, I don't know, 7 or 8 on the value scale. Moving into the other edges, and anywhere I see that dark, I fill it in much like a puzzle piece. This is how I think of everything: shape, shape, shapes. Putting the right value in the right shape. You do that enough, you have a painting. It's pretty much that easy. It's just the discipline of it. You always got to look for the shape and try to get the right value of it. And I'm just putting in all the dark values that I see in the various shapes. And I move into sort of a halftone, a mid-tone, and I lay it in. And you'll notice that I slightly darken it as it gets higher, and that creates a sort of a natural gradation that you see a lot in reflected objects. So just not brass, chrome, especially glass, anything like that. And here's the other side of the halftone, where this is more of the brassy color. Brass is nothing more than a little bit of a green tone in it, and it reflects its environment. So it's really easy to paint in that sense once you know what to look for. And I'm just laying in these brassy tones here. It's just sort of the dirty greens. And keep on building it up, looking for the shapes of that specific value. Moving on to something that's slightly darker, and then I do a little bit of blending here and there. And I go straight for the reflected light. Now, instead of taking orange and adding it to the brass color, which would end up being sort of a muddy color, I mix a straight orange and put it into the reflected light. And I think a lot of people don't generally do this. They'll add orange to the brass color to make it look like reflected light, whereas many times you just have to put in the reflected light as a reflected light, if that makes any sense. It's better to have a vibrant reflected light, especially when you have something so orange, rather than something just muddy and muted. Now I'm just putting in a little more halftones where I see them, more or less just that greeny gray. Adding a little bit of lighter lights in the brass, and they're not bright highlights. Not yet. I slowly build up to those. I'm just trying to build form right now, getting that little bit of shape. Laying down the dark values helps first as well. You lay a little bit of lighter on top, a little more variation, a little more lighter on top. It creates that variation again. I decided to darken that tabletop there a little bit in front. And here you see me do a test for the lightness, jumping up the lightness in the ground plane. Whenever I mix a color, whatever it is on my palette, I'll test it on my painting, because that's the true test, right? It doesn't matter what the value or what the color looks like on your palette, it is how the color looks on your painting. So there's always a little test first. And here I'm just throwing it in shadows. I'm choosing a violet instead of a darker orange. I just thought that would be a nice little complement to the painting, which kind of has that orangey yellow feel to it. So complement of yellow, of course, is violet. And it's close enough to orange that it works anyway. Doing a little more finer detail now, throwing in some darks here. Trying to get the extra bit of depth going on. Once I established the rest of the values, it started to become a little flat, so that told me that, oh, okay, I need to go a little bit darker in the darks, and I might adjust that again a little bit later, but I can't remember right now. Sort of just trying to build up some areas, having trouble with some areas, deciding to move on, fixing another area. I'll come back to that area again, but more or less right now I'm just sticking with the darks, trying to get that value built up. And remember, if you make the value of the darks a little bit bigger than it's intended, that's okay, because you can come over top of it with some lights. Adjusting the background a little bit, trying to create a better form for the shape. And it's the thing with painting, right? You put something in, it can always be fixed. If the outside shape needs to be adjusted, adjust it with the background. If the background creeped into the object too much, fix it by filling it in with the object. It's a dance back and forth. I'm going back into the reflected light a little bit there. And again, I go back into the darks. When I paint, I jump around a lot, and I find that really helps the enjoyment of the painting process, and also my my ability to see things fresh. If you stick in one area too long, you get frustrated and you just want to quit. Whereas if you just say, wait a second, I'm going to move on to another area, you'll come back to the other area that was giving you some problems with some fresh eyes, and it'll go along a lot easier, right? Adding a little bit of more light at the base of that bugle coming up, adding that line that we see here. You'll see me bring it out a little bit more with some palette knife work near the end. I'm getting more into the violet tones and a little bit of knife work, just to get that straight edge. It didn't really do much as it's in the same value, but it's more of a reminder to myself that later on there's going to be a nice highlight there. I'm starting to bring the lights in a little bit more. Since the lights are really flat, I got to build them up a little bit more. And I'd rather take my time and build something up than try to throw a bright value in there, have it be wrong, than try to tone it down and end up getting a lot of what you call mud, I guess. So I try to build up slowly. I get better results that way. Where are we here? Just still working on those highlights as I go. Trying to create a intermediate step value there between the light and the dark on that straight part of the bugle, just to help round off the front and give it a little more form. I think I'm using that same a little more richer dirty green, I guess you can call it, into the bugle as well. Not just for continuity, just because it's actually what I saw at the time. Feathering some edges. I mean, this bugle is reflective, but it's not chrome. It's a dirty brass, and so a lot of the reflections in it don't have a lot of harsh transitions. They're a little softer. I was going in there and adjusting again with the background, and here I am thinking I'm adjusting those edges. Some edges I leave really soft, some edges I bring up to create really sharp. It really all depends how I think I want to have the viewer dance through the painting. Going up to the top of the bugle, coming down to the base of the bugle, adding a little bit of reflected light in the shadows. That's always a good way to bring your subject to life, is reflected light. Here again, going into the ground plane and really pushing the value of the light, and you can see that's given it a little more depth now. So there's light passing behind the bugle in this instance, more so than before. And I've started using that same value into the highlights of the reflected light in the bugle, and now I'm working in a little more darker violets, just trying to not only bring color to the object, but bring a little more life to it. And again, here you see me gradating a little bit darker as we go a little bit higher up, bringing some more darks along an edge. Each step of the way, my shapes get smaller and smaller, more or less, right? Because at the beginning we filled in large shapes with large areas of value. And as we progress through the painting, we're still adding shapes of value, but just smaller shapes of value. And the smaller you go, the more details you get, right? And if I kept on going, it would turn into more of a hyperrealism piece, which isn't something I really enjoy. I like the more impressionistic, painterly style, so I leave it at a point like that near the end. And I'm going back into the darks just with a little bit of different color, a little bit deeper violet, trying to push those darker violets at the seam. That's where I saw them congregating. A little bit of orange in that violet, right? Something like that still starts to bring things a little bit of life. And palette knife work now. So instead of just using my brush all the time, I'm starting to use the palette knife for the reflections. And this is a good thing to do because the palette knife will lay on the paint in a sharp line in a sense, much different than a brush would. A brush would kind of want to melt the edges, whereas a palette knife puts it on a little more starkly, which works really well for reflective objects like this bugle, or glass of course, or even something that's chrome. And I keep on playing around, just trying to give some sharp edges in that reflected light. Sharp edges that you can never really get with a brush if you're working with oil. It'd be really difficult, especially when you start getting thicker. So that's where a palette knife comes in handy. And I start to increase the intensity of the highlights in different areas. More so at the bottom there especially, right? It's really reflective, so I increase the intensity of that value, and I place it in certain areas that I think I just want to bring out. And you'll see some of those areas where I bring that bright highlight in, I'll actually go in and tone them down a little bit, because I found that that's where I didn't want my eye to go. I wanted to guide my eye to a different location. So you just got to be careful, right? Make a decision to put it in with always it always in your mind that you can change it. And it's freeing that way. You're making the decision to paint something a certain way, but you know you can change it at any time, and that way nothing's ever really set in concrete, right? Much like this highlight that I'm working on now. I took some out, put a little bit more in. I'm adding a little more highlight along that straight edge now, adjusting it with my brush because I didn't like how it terminated it at a certain point. Now I'm going in and adjusting the edges with the kind of the highlight on the shadow side of the bugle. And each step, it's just adding something more that I want to see within that bugle. And here's a little more saturated green, and you can see the green against the violet against the orange really starts to bring a lot more life into an object. So I encourage you to try that. I mean, the key to this though is I'm just not throwing in color. Those colors are all the same value, and you can see that the same values. If you squint, all the edges start to melt together, okay? And that way you can tell that all those colors in there are the same value. But when you open your eyes, it starts to bring a little more life to the object. And more or less here, I'm just trying to tweak some of the lights in that base area, adjusting some edges, making sure that I get sharper edges where I want them, softer edges where I want to distract your eye from. Just trying to build up the character of the bugle more than anything. I mean, it's a beat up old bugle. I don't know how old it is. It's definitely an antique. I'm just trying to give it the character it deserves, even though it's just a single still life. And if you're curious, I think in total time, this might have taken me 3 hours over a period of 3 days. I just had other things to do that I couldn't sit down for a dedicated amount of time. It's always good to take a little bit of fresher look at painting. Stop for a while, come back, stop for a while, come back. And here I'm just, what am I doing now? I'm just tweaking in, adjusting the sort of the highlights on the right hand side. Trying to, not highlights, but mid-tones, I guess, trying to bring them to life a little bit more. And here I'm using the back of my brush, and I'm actually scratching into the paint to reveal highlights that I could never achieve even with a knife, right? I work on a white canvas, so whenever I scratch away, it leaves a very fine line, semi-highlight, but it's not a bright value. It's sort of a mid-value highlight, and it works really well in oil painting, I find. And darkening up that front of that table a little bit more, just trying to elevate you into the painting and a little bit, and I'll soften some of those edges down there as well. There you go. Because straight edges in a painting, I find, don't let you enter a piece. So if I didn't have the soft edges on the left, I don't think I'd be able to come up as nicely into the bugle in itself. Now I'm just trying to put a little more saturated orange reflected light in there, moving in, adjusting the background, putting in some darks, adjusting the background over the darks, It's a real dance at this point, just trying to find nuances that I want to fix, right? That highlight I made a little bit thinner by putting some dark over the right hand edge, thus making it less prominent. Just little things like this that I think it needs. And there is a point where I kind of mix a value, go to put it on my canvas, but I don't, and I kind of look around and see where else I can adjust things, and nothing really needs to be adjusted. So that's how I know a painting is done. Later on, of course, I can always come back and say, oh, I should have done this, I should have done that. But you know, every painting needs to finish at one point, and I find that when I don't really find myself wanting to put anything more in at that time, then it's complete. Now you see I just put in that highlight with a knife. It was a little too stark for me, so I went in and adjusted it with the brush a little bit, and then I threw in a little bit of a dark. It was too stark for me, so I adjusted it with the brush. So just because you put it in doesn't mean you have to leave it in. And there I sign my name, and this is the completed piece. I want to thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed a little bit longer narration. If you really liked it, please hit that like button, and if you want to see more, hit that subscribe button. Thank you so much.